She lost everything and accepted shelter in a stranger's mansion. Little did she know she was sleeping on land that once belonged to her family. The rain hit Sarah's face like ice-cold needles, but she couldn't move from that park bench. Her suitcase sat beside her, everything she owned reduced to whatever fit inside that battered leather case. The Mitchell family business, 20 years of her life, gone, stolen by the man she'd trusted most. Thunder crashed overhead, as if the sky itself was angry about the injustice. She didn't hear the car pull up through the storm, didn't notice the footsteps approaching until a voice cut through the chaos. "Mom, you're going to freeze out here." Sarah looked up to see a young man, maybe in his 20s, holding an umbrella that did nothing against the sideways rain. His expensive jacket was already soaked, but his eyes held genuine concern. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice barely audible over the storm. "No, you're not." He extended his hand. "I'm Daniel Reed, and you're coming with me." Something in his tone left no room for argument. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe desperation, but Sarah found herself taking his hand. The warmth of his fingers was the first comfort she'd felt in weeks. The mansion appeared through the storm like something from a dream. Rolling hills of Vermont stretched endlessly, and the house itself seemed to emerge from the mountainside, all stone and timber and endless windows that glowed against the darkness. Sarah stared as Daniel's car wound up the long driveway. "This is your home," she whispered. "Home?" He said the word like it tasted bitter. "Yeah, I suppose it is." Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, appeared the moment they entered. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back severely, but her eyes were kind as they took in Sarah's bedraggled state. "The blue room is ready, Mr. Reed," she said quietly, as if she'd been expecting this moment. "You knew I was bringing someone home?" Daniel asked, surprised. Mrs. Henderson's smile was mysterious. "I know many things, dear boy. Come along, miss. Let's get you into something dry." As Sarah followed the housekeeper up the grand staircase, she caught Daniel watching her with an expression she couldn't read. There was pain there, fresh and raw, like he understood exactly what it felt like to lose everything. The blue room was larger than Sarah's entire apartment had been. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and someone had laid out clothes in her size. Too perfect to be coincidence. "How did you know?" Sarah asked Mrs. Henderson. "I know what, dear?" "My size, that I'd need help tonight." Mrs. Henderson busied herself with towels. "Sometimes the universe sends us exactly what we need when we need it. The trick is being ready to receive it." That first night, Sarah barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard's face, her business partner for 15 years, the man she'd trusted with everything. The contracts he'd forged, the clients he'd stolen, the reputation he'd destroyed with lies so calculated, they seemed almost artistic in their cruelty. She'd built Mitchell Consulting from nothing, started in her garage after her divorce, working 18-hour days to prove she could make it alone. 20 years later, she was employing 30 people, helping small businesses across New England grow and thrive, until Richard decided he wanted it all for himself. The lawsuits had drained her savings. The rumors he'd spread made her unemployable. Within 6 months, she'd lost her business, her house, her entire life's work, all because she'd trusted the wrong person. At 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and wandered downstairs. The mansion felt different in the darkness, larger somehow, filled with shadows and history. She found herself in what appeared to be a library, walls lined floor to ceiling with books, a dying fire casting dancing light across leather-bound spines. "Can't sleep either." Sarah spun to find Daniel sitting in a chair she hadn't noticed, a glass of something amber in his hand. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding. This house is too big for one person anyway." He gestured to a chair across from him. "Join me." Misery loves company. Sarah sat carefully, still wearing the borrowed clothes Mrs. Henderson had provided. "You said either. What keeps you awake?" Daniel's laugh was hollow. "Wedding planning. Or rather, the lack thereof. Amazing how quickly 20 years of friendship can evaporate when someone decides you're not worth the trouble." "She left you?" 3 days before the ceremony. Apparently my emotional unavailability and workaholic tendencies were no longer charming. He took a long sip. Her exact words were that she needed someone who could love her more than his bank account. "I'm sorry." "Are you? Or are you thinking what everyone else thinks, that she was probably right?" Sarah studied his face in the firelight. Despite his youth, there were lines around his eyes that spoke of pressure and responsibility beyond his years. I'm thinking that anyone who waits until 3 days before the wedding to voice those concerns was looking for an excuse. Something shifted in Daniel's expression. That's not what I expected you to say. People disappoint us, Mr. Reed, usually because we expect them to be better than they are, rather than accepting who they actually show us they are. You sound like someone who's learned that lesson the hard way. Sarah's throat tightened. My business partner. 15 years together. I thought he was family. Turns out he was just waiting for the right moment to destroy me. They sat in comfortable silence, two wounded souls sharing space in the darkness. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to calm. What did you do? Daniel asked quietly, before everything fell apart. Business consulting. I helped small companies grow, restructure, find their footing. I was good at it. Her voice cracked slightly. Or I thought I was. What happened? Sarah closed her eyes. Even now, weeks later, it felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Richard forged contracts, made it look like I was skimming money from client accounts. By the time I realized what was happening, he'd already convinced 3 major clients to leave and take their business to his new firm. The same firm you'd helped him start. No, the firm he stole from me while I slept. The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. The lawyers said I could fight it, but it would take years and cost more than I had. Meanwhile, he was already spreading rumors that I was unstable, unreliable. In 6 months, I went from running a successful business to being unemployable. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. What's your background? Education, experience. MBA from Boston University. 25 years in business development and strategic planning. Not that it matters now. It matters. His voice was firm. Experience like that doesn't disappear because one person decided to be a bastard. Sarah looked at him, really looked, and saw something unexpected. Beneath the pain of his recent betrayal, there was a sharpness, an intelligence that reminded her of herself at his age. But there was also something else, a loneliness that seemed bone deep. What about you? She asked. How does someone your age end up with all this? Daniel gestured around the library, but his expression was tired. Technology investments. Started when I was 19 with money from a small inheritance. Got lucky with a few sustainable energy startups, then kept reinvesting. The money grew faster than I knew what to do with it. And your family? Dead. Parents died in a car accident when I was 22. I have an aunt and uncle who check in occasionally, but they're more interested in making sure I'm not squandering the family name than actually caring about my well-being. The loneliness in his voice was achingly familiar. Sarah had felt it every day since her divorce 10 years ago. Every evening in her empty apartment, every holiday spent alone because her work had become her only family. So, here we are, she said softly. 2 people who had everything and lost it all. Did we have everything? Or did we just tell ourselves we did? The question hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the storm had finally passed, but inside, something new was beginning. A connection neither of them had expected or asked for. I should let you get some sleep, Sarah said, starting to rise. Wait. Daniel's voice stopped her. Tomorrow, would you like to see the property? I mean, if you're planning to stay for a while, which I hope you are, this place could use some life in it. Sarah hesitated. Accepting his help felt dangerous, like stepping onto ice she couldn't trust to hold her weight. But the alternative was going back out into a world that had already decided she was worthless. I'd like that, she said finally. As she headed back upstairs, she passed an open door she hadn't noticed before. It appeared to be an office, and in the soft light from the hallway, she could see papers scattered across a massive desk. Financial statements, what looked like charity documents, spreadsheets with numbers that made her breath catch. Daniel Reed wasn't just wealthy. He was managing the kind of money that could change thousands of lives, and from what she could see in those scattered papers, he was trying to do exactly that, but struggling with the complexity of it all. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something stir inside her chest. Not hope exactly, but possibility. Maybe her expertise wasn't as worthless as Richard had tried to make her believe. But as she continued up the stairs, another thought nagged at her. Mrs. Henderson's preparedness, the way she'd known exactly what Sarah would need, the knowing look in the older woman's eyes. This felt orchestrated somehow, but by whom? And why? Sarah paused at the top of the stairs, looking back down at the library where Daniel still sat in the darkness. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than a simple rescue from a storm. She could feel it in the air, like electricity before lightning strikes. The question was whether she was ready for what came next, or if she'd run again when things got complicated. Because looking at Daniel Reed, alone in his mansion with his mountains of money and acres of responsibility, she could already sense that complicated was exactly what this was going to be. The old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times, and Sarah finally went to bed. But sleep remained elusive. Tomorrow would bring daylight and questions, and the need to make decisions about a future that had felt impossible just hours ago. But tonight, for the first time in months, she wasn't sitting alone in the rain. Morning came with golden light streaming through windows Sarah hadn't fully appreciated in the darkness. The view from her room was breathtaking. Rolling hills covered in autumn colors, a small lake that reflected the sky like a mirror, and in the distance, mountains that seemed to touch the clouds themselves. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Henderson entered with a breakfast tray that smelled like heaven. "Mr. Reed asked me to tell you he's in his office, whenever you're ready for that tour," the housekeeper said, setting the tray on a small table by the window. "Mrs. Henderson, can I ask you something?" The older woman paused, her hands smoothing an already perfect tablecloth. "Of course, dear. Yesterday when I arrived, you were prepared for me. The room, the clothes, everything. How?" Mrs. Henderson's smile was gentle but evasive. "I've worked for the Reed family for 32 years. You learn to anticipate needs. But you couldn't have anticipated a stranger showing up in a storm. Couldn't I?" Mrs. Henderson moved toward the door. "Eat your breakfast, dear. You'll need your strength for what lies ahead." The cryptic response only deepened Sarah's suspicions, but before she could ask more questions, the housekeeper was gone. An hour later, Sarah found Daniel in the office she'd glimpsed the night before. In daylight, the chaos was even more apparent. Financial statements covered every surface. Sticky notes with incomprehensible calculations decorated his computer monitor, and he looked like he hadn't slept at all. "This is what keeps me up at night," he said without preamble, gesturing at the mess. "I made all this money, and now everyone expects me to know how to give it away responsibly. Charities, foundations, community projects, I'm funding dozens of them, but I have no idea if I'm actually helping anyone or just throwing money into black holes." Sarah stepped closer to the desk, her trained eye automatically organizing the information she saw. Revenue reports, grant applications, audit statements. It was familiar territory, but the scope was staggering. "How much are we talking about?" she asked. "This year alone, about 12 million in charitable giving. Last year it was 8. The money keeps growing faster than I can distribute it meaningfully." Sarah's breath caught. She'd helped businesses manage budgets in the hundreds of thousands, occasionally millions. But 12 million in charity alone meant Daniel's total wealth was beyond anything she'd imagined. "What are your priorities? What causes matter to you?" Daniel ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that made him look even younger than his 27 years. "That's the problem, I don't know. My parents were the ones with the vision, the passion for helping people. I just know how to make money multiply. But having money isn't the same as knowing how to use it." For the first time in months, Sarah felt the familiar spark of professional excitement. This wasn't just about charity, it was about strategy, impact assessment, sustainable giving models, everything she'd been trained to do. "May I?" She gestured toward the papers. Daniel nodded, and Sarah began organizing the documents with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years making sense of financial chaos. Within minutes, she'd identified 3 distinct categories of giving, several obvious redundancies, and at least 2 organizations that were clearly mismanaging their grants. "Here," she said, pointing to a particularly concerning audit report. "Mountain View Youth Center. You've given them $200,000 over the past year, but their financial statements don't match their program reports. Either they're lying about their impact, or someone's stealing the money." Daniel leaned over her shoulder to look at the papers, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive but understated. "How can you tell so quickly?" "Experience. I've seen this pattern before. They're reporting serving 300 kids annually, but their supply receipts show purchases for maybe 50. The numbers don't add up. So what do I do? Surprise audit. Show up unannounced with a financial consultant, someone independent who can assess their actual operations versus their reports. Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying her face. Someone like you. The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Working with Daniel would mean staying longer, getting deeper involved in his life, risking the growing attraction she was trying to ignore. I'm not licensed to operate in Vermont, she said carefully. Licenses can be transferred. The question is whether you want to. Before Sarah could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID made her stomach drop. Richard Morrison. I need to take this, she said, stepping away from Daniel. Sarah. Richard's voice was honey-sweet poison. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. We need to talk. We have nothing to discuss. Oh, but we do. I've just learned something very interesting about your new living arrangements. Daniel Reed, isn't it? Quite the upgrade from that studio apartment you were renting? Sarah's blood turned cold. How do you know where I am? I make it my business to know. And I think young Mr. Reed should know exactly who he's harboring in his beautiful home. A woman who stole from her own clients, who's currently under investigation for embezzlement. That's a lie and you know it. Do I? Because I have documents that say otherwise. Documents I'd hate to see reach the wrong people. The Vermont State Attorney General, for instance, or the IRS, or maybe just the local newspapers. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of Richard's manipulation settling around her like a trap. What do you want? A conversation. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, the coffee shop on Main Street in Stowe. Come alone and keep your mouth shut about our business arrangements until we've had a chance to clarify things. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone with shaking hands. Everything okay? Daniel's voice startled her. She turned to find him watching her with concern, and for a moment she almost told him everything. Almost warned him about the poison Richard would try to spread, the lies he'd use to destroy this fragile new beginning. Instead, she forced a smile. Fine. Just someone from my past. Daniel didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Ready for that tour? The grounds were even more spectacular than Sarah had imagined. Daniel led her along winding paths through gardens that had clearly been designed by someone with both artistic vision and unlimited resources. They passed a greenhouse filled with exotic plants, a stable with horses that looked like they belonged in Kentucky Derby, and finally arrived at a small lake with a dock that stretched into water so clear she could see fish swimming near the bottom. This is where I come to think, Daniel said, settling onto a bench at the water's edge. My parents used to bring me here when I was a kid, before the accident. Tell me about them. Daniel was quiet for so long, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory and grief. They were good people. Really good. Not just charity gala good. My mother volunteered at the homeless shelter every Wednesday, not because it looked nice in the society pages, but because she genuinely cared about the people there. So my father funded scholarships for kids who couldn't afford college, but he also tutored them personally to make sure they'd succeed. They sound wonderful. They were. And they left me all this responsibility that I have no idea how to handle. Every day, I make decisions that affect hundreds of people, and I'm terrified I'm going to mess it all up. Sarah felt something twist in her chest. Recognition, empathy, and something dangerously close to maternal instinct. You're not messing it up. You're trying, which is more than most people in your position would do. Am I? Or am I just throwing money around to make myself feel better? The youth center issue proves you care about more than just writing checks. You want to make sure the money's being used properly. That matters. Daniel turned to look at her directly. Stay. What? Stay. Help me figure this out. I'll pay you whatever you were making before, plus housing, plus benefits. I need someone I can trust, and you need a fresh start. We can help each other. It was exactly what Sarah wanted to hear, and exactly what she was afraid of. Working closely with Daniel meant spending time with him, getting to know him better, allowing herself to care about someone who was 18 years younger and completely out of her league. But it also meant security, purpose, a chance to rebuild her reputation, doing work that actually mattered. I need time to think about it, she said finally. Of course, take all the time you need. They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, but Sarah's mind was racing. Richard's threat hung over her like a storm cloud. If she stayed, if she got involved with Daniel's charitable foundation, Richard would find a way to destroy it all. He'd already proven he was capable of burning down everything she'd built. Why would he hesitate to do it again? That evening, as she sat in her room trying to decide what to do, Sarah noticed something that made her heart stop. On the dresser, partially hidden behind a picture frame, was a manila folder she hadn't seen before. Inside were documents that changed everything. The first was a property deed from 1943, showing that a significant portion of the land where Reed Manor now stood had originally belonged to the Mitchell family. Her great-grandfather's signature was clear at the bottom of the transfer document. The second was a letter dated 1944, written in her grandfather's careful handwriting. To Henry Reed, "I pray you will understand why I had to sell the land. The business failed, the debts were overwhelming, and I had no choice. Please know that this property has been in the Mitchell family for 3 generations, and it breaks my heart to let it go. I only ask that you remember us fondly, and that this land continues to bring joy to families as it did to ours." The third document was Henry Reed's response. To John Mitchell, "This land will be treasured and preserved. Should your family ever wish to return, they will always be welcome here. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." Sarah sank into the chair by the window, her hands shaking. This was her family's land. The mansion where she was staying as charity had been built on property that should have been her inheritance. But there was more. At the bottom of the folder was a recent document, a property search Daniel had commissioned just 3 weeks ago. He'd been researching the history of his land, and he knew exactly who she was before he'd found her in that storm. The rescue hadn't been random. The kindness hadn't been spontaneous. Daniel Reed knew she was a Mitchell, and he'd brought her here for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. Sarah's hands clenched around the papers. Another betrayal, another manipulation, another person who'd pretended to care while pursuing his own agenda. Just like Richard, just like her ex-husband, just like everyone else who'd ever claimed to want to help her. She was stuffing clothes into her suitcase when someone knocked on the door. "Sarah? It's Mrs. Henderson. May I come in?" "I'm leaving," Sarah called out, not stopping her frantic packing. "I know, dear, that's why we need to talk." The door opened, and Mrs. Henderson entered with the same calm presence she'd shown from the beginning. She took in the suitcase, the scattered papers, Sarah's tear-streaked face, and nodded as if she'd expected exactly this scene. "You found the documents? You mean the evidence that this entire thing has been a lie? That your employer knew exactly who I was and decided to play some sick game with the woman whose family used to own his precious mansion?" Mrs. Henderson sat down in the chair across from Sarah's bed, her expression sad but unsurprised. "Sit down, child. Let me tell you a story. I don't want to hear—" "Sit down." Something in the older woman's tone brooked no argument. Sarah perched on the edge of the bed, suitcase half packed, ready to bolt at the first sign of more lies. "I knew your grandfather," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "John Mitchell was my father's best friend. I was 8 years old when your family lost this land, and I watched your grandfather cry as he signed those papers. He loved this place like it was part of his soul." Sarah's anger wavered slightly. "What does that have to do with anything? Daniel doesn't know who you are." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "What?" "The property research was my suggestion. I've been asking him for years to look into the history of this land, to understand the legacy he inherited. When he finally commissioned that search 3 weeks ago, I saw your grandfather's name and knew the universe was preparing something special." "You're lying." "Am I? Then why don't you ask Daniel directly? March downstairs right now and confront him. See what he says when you show him those papers." Sarah stared at the older woman, her mind reeling. "You orchestrated this. You knew I was in town. You knew I'd lost everything. And you manipulated your employer into finding me." Mrs. Henderson smiled sadly. "I knew you were in trouble, yes. Word travels fast in small communities, and the Mitchell name still carries weight here, even after all these years. When I heard what that man did to you, what he stole from John Mitchell's granddaughter, I knew I had to act. So you used Daniel. I suggested he take a drive that night. I mentioned that the storm would be hard on anyone caught outside. I may have implied that acts of kindness often come back to bless the giver." Mrs. Henderson's eyes twinkled with mischief that was almost childlike. But Daniel made his own choice to stop, his own choice to help, his own choice to invite you to stay. Sarah felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Why? Why go to all this trouble for someone you don't even know? Because I made a promise to your grandfather 60 years ago. He asked me to watch over this land, to make sure the Reed family honored their commitment to preserve it. But I also promised him that if any Mitchell ever needed help, I'd do whatever I could to provide it. The room was silent except for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. Outside, she could hear Daniel moving around downstairs, probably wondering where she'd disappeared to after their walk. "He really doesn't know who I am," she whispered. "He knows you're Sarah Mitchell, a business consultant who lost everything to a corrupt partner. He knows you're intelligent, capable, and exactly what his charitable foundation needs. He doesn't know this was your family's land, and he doesn't know I've been hoping for years that somehow, someway, a Mitchell would come home." Sarah looked down at the papers in her lap, then at her half-packed suitcase, then at Mrs. Henderson's kind, weathered face. "What am I supposed to do with this information?" "That's up to you, child. But I will say this. That boy downstairs is lonelier than he wants to admit, carrying more responsibility than any 27-year-old should have to bear. And you're the first person I've seen in years who looks at him like he's Daniel Reed the person, not Daniel Reed the bank account." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. "Richard again. Don't even think about running. I know where you are, and I know how to find you. 2 o'clock tomorrow, or I start making phone calls." Mrs. Henderson noticed her expression. "Trouble?" Sarah closed her eyes. Richard would never stop hunting her. He'd proven that already. Running would only delay the inevitable confrontation, and meanwhile she'd be throwing away the first real opportunity she'd had in months. Maybe it was time to stop running and start fighting back. "Mrs. Henderson," she said slowly, "what do you know about exposing corrupt business practices?" The older woman's smile was sharp as a blade. "More than you might expect, dear. More than you might expect." The next morning, Sarah walked into the coffee shop in Stowe with a recording device hidden in her purse and a plan that Mrs. Henderson had helped her craft until 3 in the morning. Richard was already there, looking smugly confident in his expensive suit, choosing a corner table where he thought no one could overhear their conversation. He was wrong. "You look better than I expected," Richard said as she sat down. "Rural living agrees with you. Cut the pleasantries. What do you want? Straight to business. I always admired that about you, Sarah. No time for social niceties." He leaned back in his chair like a man who held all the cards. "I want you to convince your new boyfriend to invest in my expansion project. 5 million should do it." Sarah almost laughed. "You're insane if you think I'd help you steal more money." "Steal? Sarah, you wound me. This is a legitimate business opportunity. Reed Enterprises expanding into sustainable consulting. With Morrison Development as the local partner, everyone wins. Except the clients you'll defraud." Richard's smile turned cold. "Careful, Sarah. You're in no position to make accusations, not when I have documentation of your own questionable practices. Documentation you fabricated. Can you prove that? Because I have 3 former clients who will testify that you convinced them to make investments that mysteriously disappeared. I have bank records showing transfers from their accounts to offshore companies. I have emails with your digital signature authorizing those transfers." Sarah felt sick, but forced herself to stay calm. "All forgeries. Prove it. In court. While you're fighting criminal charges for embezzlement." Richard leaned forward. "Or you can make this very simple. Introduce me to Daniel Reed, recommend my services, and all of this unpleasantness goes away forever. And if I refuse, then tomorrow morning, the Vermont State Attorney General gets a very detailed package about Sarah Mitchell's criminal activities. By noon, it'll be in the newspapers. By evening, your rich boyfriend will know exactly what kind of woman he's been harboring." Sarah stood up slowly. "I need time to think." "You have until tonight. Call me with your decision." Richard's confidence was absolute. "Oh, and Sarah, don't even consider running again. I have people watching the Reed property. You can't hide from this forever." Sarah walked out of the coffee shop with her heart pounding, but for the first time in months it wasn't from fear. It was from rage, pure, clean anger that burned away the shame and self-doubt Richard had been feeding her for so long. She drove back to the mansion where she found Daniel in the library, reading what looked like grant applications. He looked up when she entered, and his smile made her chest tight with feelings she wasn't ready to name. "How was your trip to town?" he asked. "Educational." Sarah sat down across from him. "Daniel, I need to tell you something important, but first, I need to ask you a question." Something in her tone made him set down the papers and give her his full attention. "Okay. When you commissioned that property research 3 weeks ago, what were you looking for?" Daniel looked surprised by the question. "Mrs. Henderson suggested it. She said I should understand the history of the land, honor the families who lived here before us. Why? Did the name Mitchell mean anything to you when you saw it in the records? Should it have?" He was clearly confused now. "Sarah, what's going on?" She pulled out the folder Mrs. Henderson had left for her. "This property used to belong to my family. My great-grandfather built the original house here. My grandfather sold it to yours during the Depression when the family business failed." Daniel stared at the documents, his face cycling through confusion, understanding, and something that might have been betrayal. "You're telling me you have a claim to this land?" "I'm telling you the truth. Something I should have done yesterday, but I was too scared and too angry to think clearly." "Scared of what?" Sarah took a deep breath and told him everything. Richard's betrayal, the forged documents, the threats, the meeting this morning, everything except the growing feelings that made her want to protect Daniel from the storm that was coming. When she finished, Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question she'd been dreading. "Do you want the land back?" "What?" "This property. Legally, morally, it belongs to your family. Do you want me to sign it back over to you?" The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Sarah couldn't speak for a moment. No, that's not why I told you. I told you because someone's trying to use my past to hurt you, and you deserve to know the truth. This Richard Morrison, what exactly is he threatening?" Sarah explained the ultimatum, watching Daniel's expression grow darker with each detail. "He's blackmailing you into setting me up." "Yes. And if you refuse, he'll destroy what's left of your reputation and probably have you arrested on false charges." "Yes." Daniel was quiet for another long moment. Then he smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "Well then, I think it's time, Mr. Morrison learned what happens when someone threatens my family." The word family hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Daniel, no, listen to me. I don't care about your grandfather's land deal. I don't care that Mrs. Henderson orchestrated our meeting. I care that someone is trying to hurt you, and I'm not going to let that happen. You don't understand what you're up against. Richard is smart, connected, and completely without conscience. He's destroyed everything I spent 20 years building. Then it's a good thing I have resources he doesn't." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Daniel was pulling out his phone and making a call that would change everything. "Marcus, it's Daniel Reed. I need that favor you've been promising me." "Yes, now." "Richard Morrison, Morrison Development. I need everything you can find on him, and I need it by tonight." "Yes, everything. Financial records, client complaints, anything that doesn't look legitimate. I don't care what it costs." He hung up and turned back to Sarah. "Marcus Chen, best private investigator in New England. If there's dirt on Morrison, he'll find it." "Daniel, you can't just watch me." His voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Nobody threatens my people and walks away clean." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Marcus Chen's preliminary report arrived by email at 6 o'clock, and it was devastating. Richard Morrison had been running variations of the same scam for over a decade, leaving a trail of destroyed businesses and ruined lives across 3 states. "Look at this," Daniel said, pointing to the screen. 17 former business partners, all claiming fraud. 6 criminal complaints that were mysteriously dropped. Bank records showing a pattern of fund transfers that look exactly like what he did to you. Sarah stared at the evidence, feeling vindicated and furious and hopeful all at once. "This is enough to destroy him. It's enough to put him in prison. But we're going to do something better." "What do you mean?" Daniel's smile was predatory. "We're going to give him exactly what he wants." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Daniel would agree to meet with Richard about the investment opportunity. He'd even expressed serious interest in the $5 million partnership. But the meeting would take place at Reed Manor, with Marcus Chen recording everything from multiple hidden cameras. Richard would inevitably reveal his true intentions, probably try to pressure Daniel into making a quick decision, and almost certainly let slip details about his fraudulent documentation against Sarah. Once they had him on tape admitting to forgery and blackmail, they'd have everything they needed to destroy him permanently. "It's too dangerous," Sarah protested. "If he suspects anything, he won't. His ego won't let him believe someone my age could outmaneuver him. And if you're wrong?" Daniel reached across the desk and took her hand. "Then we'll figure it out together. I'm not abandoning you, Sarah. Not to him, not to anyone." The touch of his fingers sent electricity up her arm, and Sarah found herself staring into eyes that held more determination than any 27-year-old should possess. Somewhere along the way, this scared young man had become someone she could lean on, someone willing to fight for her when she'd forgotten how to fight for herself. The meeting was set for the following evening. Richard arrived in his expensive car, clearly impressed by the mansion and already calculating how much money he could extract from its owner. Sarah watched from an upstairs window as Daniel greeted him with perfect courtesy, playing the part of the naive young millionaire to perfection. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see Richard's body language growing more confident as the evening progressed. He was in his element, spinning lies and manipulation with the skill of a master, never suspecting that every word was being recorded. At 9:30, her phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "It's over. Come down." Sarah found them in the library, where Richard was shaking Daniel's hand with obvious satisfaction. "Sarah," Richard's voice was honey-sweet. "I was just telling Daniel what a pleasure it's been working with you over the years. Such a talented woman, Mr. Morrison was just explaining his investment proposal," Daniel said smoothly. "Fascinating stuff, especially the part about the documentation he has regarding your past business practices." Richard's smile faltered slightly. "Just ensuring full transparency, of course. Of course, the kind of transparency that involves forged bank records and fabricated client testimonials." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Richard's mask slipped completely. "I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, I'm stating facts." Daniel gestured to a laptop that hadn't been there when Richard arrived. 17 former business partners, Mr. Morrison, 6 criminal complaints, a pattern of fraud that goes back over a decade. Richard looked between Daniel and Sarah, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and finally, calculation. "You can't prove any of that." "Actually, I can, along with recordings of tonight's conversation, where you admitted to creating false documentation to frame Sarah for embezzlement." That was taken out of context. "Was it? Marcus, would you join us, please?" Marcus Chen emerged from the doorway where he'd been waiting, carrying a briefcase that looked ominous in the library's soft lighting. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said pleasantly, "I have warrants for financial audits of 3 of your companies, subpoenas for your bank records, and about 6 hours of recorded conversations where you detail exactly how you've been defrauding your business partners." Richard's confident facade crumbled completely. "You can't do this to me. I have connections, lawyers." "Lawyers cost money," Daniel said quietly. "Money you won't have access to once your assets are frozen pending criminal investigation." "Sarah," Richard turned to her with desperate eyes, "you can't let them do this. We had a deal." "We never had a deal," Sarah said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You had threats and lies and stolen documents. Now you have nothing." Richard looked around the room, realizing he was completely trapped. His shoulders sagged in defeat. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Full confession," Marcus said. "Written statement detailing every fraudulent practice, every forged document, every client you've cheated. Complete financial records showing where the stolen money went, and formal apologies to every person you've destroyed. And if I refuse, then you go to prison," Daniel said simply. "Your choice." Richard Morrison, master manipulator and destroyer of lives, signed his confession at 11:15 that night. By midnight, the documents were in the hands of federal investigators, and by morning his criminal empire was finished forever. Sarah stood on the mansion's front steps, watching Richard's car disappear down the long driveway, carrying him back to a world where he'd have to face the consequences of his actions. "It's over," Daniel said softly, coming to stand beside her. "It's over," she agreed, but her voice was sad rather than triumphant. "How you don't sound happy." Sarah was quiet for a moment, trying to organize feelings that seemed too big for words. I spent so long being angry, being afraid, being ashamed. Now that it's gone, I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. Maybe you're supposed to feel free. Free to do what? Daniel turned to face her fully. Whatever you want. Stay here and help me figure out how to give away millions of dollars responsibly. Start your own consulting firm again. Travel the world. Anything. And if what I want is impossible, try me. Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing hope and affection and something deeper that made her heart race. He was 27 years old, brilliant and kind, and 18 years younger than her. He was offering her everything she'd lost and more, but accepting would mean risking her heart again with someone who could have any woman he wanted. Daniel, I know what you're thinking, he said softly. You're thinking about the age difference, about what people will say, about whether this is real or just gratitude and proximity. Isn't it? Look at me, Sarah. Really look at me. She did, and what she saw took her breath away. Not gratitude, not obligation, not even simple attraction. What she saw was love, real, deep, and absolutely certain. I've been alone in this house for 5 years, Daniel said quietly. Alone with money and responsibility, and the weight of trying to live up to my parents' memory. Then you showed up in a storm, and for the first time since they died, I remembered what it felt like to have someone to care about. Daniel, I love your mind, the way you can look at a problem and see solutions I'd never imagine. I love your strength, how you've survived things that would have broken most people. I love your integrity, the way you chose honesty even when it put you at risk. He reached up to touch her face gently. I love you, Sarah Mitchell. Not because you needed rescuing, but because you saved me right back. Sarah felt tears starting, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of sadness or fear. People will say you're too young for me. People will say a lot of things. Do you care? People will say I'm using you for your money. Are you? People will say, Sarah. Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. Do you love me? The question hung in the night air between them, surrounded by the sound of wind in the trees and the distant call of night birds. Sarah thought about everything that had brought her to this moment, the failures and betrayals, the storm that had led her to this doorstep, the kindness of strangers who'd become family. Yes, she whispered, I love you. Daniel's smile was radiant. Then that's all that matters. He kissed her then, soft and sure and full of promise, and Sarah felt the last of her defenses crumble. This was what she'd been afraid to hope for. Not just love, but partnership. Not just rescue, but mutual salvation. When they finally broke apart, Sarah was laughing through her tears. So what now? Now we figure it out together. The foundation, the charity work, whether you want to reclaim your family's land or build something entirely new. Daniel's eyes sparkled with mischief. But first, I think Mrs. Henderson owes us an explanation about exactly how much of this she orchestrated. They found the housekeeper in the kitchen, humming while she prepared what looked suspiciously like a celebration dinner. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah said sternly, we need to talk. The older woman turned with a smile that was pure innocence. About what, dear? About your matchmaking schemes. Matchmaking? I merely suggested Daniel take a drive on a stormy night. How was I to know he'd find the granddaughter of my father's dearest friend sitting alone in the rain? Daniel laughed. You're incorrigible. I'm effective, Mrs. Henderson corrected, and I keep my promises. I promised your grandfather I'd watch over this land and take care of any Mitchell who needed help. I promised your parents I'd make sure you didn't spend your whole life alone with nothing but money for company. You promised my parents I'd find love. I promised them I'd recognize it when it showed up and do everything in my power to nurture it. Mrs. Henderson's expression grew serious. This house was built for families, for laughter, for people who care about each other. It's been too quiet for too long. Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the kitchen hearth. For the first time in her adult life, she was exactly where she belonged, not because someone had rescued her, but because she'd found her way home. So, Daniel said, slipping his arm around her waist, ready to start planning the Reed Foundation's strategic giving initiative. Sarah leaned into his warmth, feeling the future spreading out before them like an uncharted map full of possibilities. Ready to change the world, one well-funded project at a time. Outside, snow began to fall, the first snow of winter, covering the mountains and valleys in pristine white. Inside Reed Manor, three people who'd found their way to each other began planning a future that honored the past while embracing everything that lay ahead. And in the library, where it all began, the fire crackled merrily, as if celebrating the fact that sometimes when you lose everything, you create space for something infinitely better to take its place. Sarah Mitchell had come to Vermont with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. She was staying with a family, a purpose, and love that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Some storms, she realized, don't come to destroy. They come to wash away everything that no longer serves, making room for the life you were always meant to live.